My name is Sera Stone. I am in 7th grade at the Capital School in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My project is titled Using Mushrooms to Remove Oil in Saltwater. I hypothesize that mushrooms can remove oil in saltwater. Oil harms plants and animals in the ocean. Oil can block whales and dolphins' blowholes and making it impossible for them to breathe. Oil also harms seabirds. When seabirds dive down to catch fish in water, oil can get on their wings, making it impossible to fly. Oil does not blend with water because water is denser than oil. In the ocean, the oil spreads on the surface of the water, then eventually clumps and sinks to the bottom. In this experiment, I had an experimental jar and a control jar. For my experimental jar, I put 2 cups of water in a plastic jar with 50 milliliters of oil, 2 cups of dried shiitake mushrooms, and 1 tablespoon of salt. For my negative control jar, I put 2 cups of water in a plastic jar with 50 milliliters of oil and 1 tablespoon of salt. To collect my data, I created a chart to record daily observations so I could see what was happening with the oil and mushrooms in the saltwater. The data chart included 7 observation questions that I created before starting the experiment based on my hypothesis. I answered the questions on the data chart each day for both the experimental jar and the negative control jar, and made additional notes about what I observed. I also took photographs of the jars at each stage to record what I was observing. It appears that my hypothesis has been proven correct. I observed that when taking the mushrooms out of the jar, some of the oil was clinging to the mushrooms. Before pulling the mushrooms out of the jar, I measured 4 milliliters of oil on the surface of water. Once half of the mushrooms were taken out of the jar, there were 2 milliliters of oil left on the surface of the water. Once I took all of the mushrooms out of the experimental jar, there was much less oil on the surface of water. The water was a reddish-brownish color. After an hour, the oil had separated and only 1 millimeter of oil remained on the surface of water. The color of the remaining water was much lighter, and I questioned whether it was mushroom tea. The juice naturally produced when dried mushrooms are rehydrated. To check this, I boiled dried mushrooms and compared the tea to the water left in the experimental jar. I found that the mushrooms tea and the water in the experiment were similar in color. This experiment shows that dried mushrooms could be helpful in removing oil from the ocean. I would like to continue this project using living oyster mushrooms. I am curious if living mushrooms will be even more effective at removing oil in saltwater. In my initial research for this next question, I have found that oyster mushrooms will grow in saltwater. I'm interested to see whether growing oyster mushrooms will break down oil better than dried shiitake mushrooms. This project was a very fun learning process for me, and I'm excited to continue exploring and experimenting.